Um, like John, I'm not quite sure how to pitch my comments. I don't want to assume too much knowledge, but then looking around the room, I think it's likely that quite a bit of what I'll have to say will be known to quite a few of you. So if it is familiar, then I ask for your forgiveness. So as the earlier speakers have alluded to, it's a fact that the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, is banned as a terrorist organisation in Australia. More specifically, it's listed in among the organisations using the regulations and the legislation. The Criminal Code Act of 1995, I think, is the relevant act. And through that listing, it's effectively banned in Australia. It's illegal as a consequence to be a member of the PKK in Australia. It's illegal to raise funds for the PKK and a number of other actions which would support the PKK here. The background to this is that the banning first took place, or the listing first took place in 2006. Many of you might be aware that the then Prime Minister Erdogan visited Australia in December 2005 for a state visit. During that visit, he was reported as calling on Australia and Turkey to cooperate more fully on security matters, among his other comments. Very soon after he left the country, the Howard government at the time took the steps to have the PKK banned as a terrorist organisation. Now, no one admits to any link between the two things, but you'd have to be very gullible to imagine that those two things weren't linked, and that the banning of the PKK in 2006 did not happen at the behest of the Turkish Prime Minister at the time and the Turkish state. Since then, the ban has been renewed every time it's come up for rehearing. The way the mechanism works is that initially every 2 years, and these days and in recent years every 3 years, the ban lapses, the listing lapses. And so the Australian state has taken steps to make sure that before that happens, each time it is due to happen, the listing is renewed. So that's been in place continuously since 2006. It's not quite a rubber stamp process, but the fact is that each time it's happened, the listing has been renewed. It's also a fact, I believe, that since the initial listing, when there were two dissenting voices on the parliamentary committee, that's the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security that Dave mentioned. In that 2006 hearing and listing, there were two dissenting voices, Duncan Kerr and John Faulkner. Since then, there hasn't been anything. So people have made submissions, people have been heard at the committee hearing in Canberra. Voices have been raised, but to no effect, and the ban has been, as I say, continuous since 2006. So the ban came up for relisting or rehearing in this year, in recent months, August and September. And so the Australians for Kurdistan group and others, KDCC here in Victoria, others around the country, took the opportunity to make submissions to the committee against the renewal of the ban. So what I just wanted to do today was to quickly run through some of the arguments against listing the PKK as a terrorist organisation, which were made in this recent opportunity. They're summarised in this brochure, which is available to take away. To cut to the chase, the listing has been renewed, so it's no longer something to be considered in the future as suggested in this brochure. But nevertheless, this brochure has the background material, and it's worth taking with you and passing on to people if you can. So our submission was fairly short. It dealt with, I would say, with political issues. There were other submissions, notably from Rob Starry's firm, who's here tonight, a legal firm who developed a submission, prepared a submission on behalf of the KDCC and another organisation in New South Wales, I believe. Individuals made submissions, and then there was ours, as I say, from the AFK. What we said was that the listing was, or the banning was wrong. We gave eight different reasons, and I'll quickly go through them as I said. First of all, I think there's a strong case that the PKK is not, in fact, involved in terrorism. It's not a terrorist organisation. Certainly, the PKK is involved in an armed struggle, or an armed conflict. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But it doesn't follow that the struggle that's involved in, the armed conflict, makes it a terrorist organisation. The PKK doesn't target civilians. It doesn't engage in indiscriminate violence. It acts largely in self-defence, is my understanding. So it lacks a lot of the characteristics of what you might regard as terrorist activity, which generally involves indiscriminate violence, indiscriminate slaughter. There are lots of examples of other organisations which have engaged in very similar struggles to the PKK and not been considered as terrorist organisations here in Australia. A good example, I think, is Fionn Skiotis in East Timor. So Fionn Skiotis was the armed resistance of the East Timorese resistance. It was engaged for a long time in an armed struggle with the military forces of Indonesia. Certainly there was bloodshed, mostly of East Timorese, but at times the Fionn Skiotis forces did kill members of the Indonesian military or Indonesian security forces. At no time was Fionn Skiotis prescribed here in Australia as a terrorist organisation. And of course, since the days of resistance, since those days of struggle, East Timor has gained its independence, and in fact Fionn Skiotis, or the members of Fionn Skiotis, went on to form the core of the new nation's armed forces, and now have that respectable role. The leader of Fionn Skiotis, of course, Shodana Gusmao, who was regarded as a terrorist by Indonesia, never by Australia, of course went on to become the leader of the new nation as President and Prime Minister. So if Fionn Skiotis was not a terrorist organisation, then arguably PKK, in a very similar situation, is not either. More broadly, you can think back in history to all kinds of examples of people defending themselves against brutality, against oppression in South Africa, many other places, all the way back, if you like, to the Second World War, where there was armed resistance to the Nazis and other Axis powers right across Europe. In Greece, where part of my family come from, very brutal circumstances. None of the opposition to the Nazis and the Axis powers was in the form of a nation state or a recognised military force. And yet today we look back on that time and regard the resistance, those national resistance forces, as heroic. And in fact, many of the current European political leaders come from that era and were involved in that sort of struggle. So again, people are not saying that the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto or the Italian resistance to the fascists in that country, the French Maquis and so on and so forth, right across Europe, were terrorists. By the same token, neither was the PKK. We also argued, secondly, that the evidence that the ban is based on is highly likely to be erroneous, to be wrong. It's the Australian security agencies who provide material to the Minister, the Department, and then the Minister making the decision. Rob can correct me if I'm getting some of the technical details wrong. I'm not a lawyer.